This is ILM Circle, a learning workshop presented by the Islamic Speakers Bureau of Arizona, or ISBA. ILM stands for Intentional Learning for Mutual Respect, the foundation of what ISBA is all about.
Welcome to the December ILM Circles. My name is Michelle Marion, and I'm very pleased to welcome all of you tonight to a very engaging topic. It will help clarify many things in my mind, I am very pleased to be able to welcome our guest speaker tonight. Alan Zaitchik is with us, and he has been attending some of the previous sessions, so he's a veteran of the ILM circles, which is really nice. Our topic tonight is Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform Judaism. What is the difference? So after tonight, we will have a better idea of how to make those distinctions. Our guest presenter tonight, Mr. Zaitchik, is a computer scientist and software engineer in his day job. And he has worked for the past several decades in technology, publishing, and marketing, currently for Oracle, which many of us are quite familiar with. When he's not toiling in technology, he serves as the board chair of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Phoenix, and is the past board member of the Jewish Federation of Greater Phoenix. He sits on the board of advisors for the Hebrew Union College and Jewish Institute of Religion, a seminary with campuses in New York, Los Angeles, Cincinnati, and Jerusalem. Alan is also the only lay or non-ordained member of the ethics committee of the Central Conferences of American Rabbis. Alan is very excited to present on this topic. We've been kind of chatting a little bit while we were waiting for all of our guests to join us. And he has attended an Orthodox Jewish day school, belonged to a conservative synagogue, and then became the president of a Reform synagogue. He and his wife, Carol, who also grew up Orthodox, had a traditional Orthodox wedding, and today are at Temple High, a Reform synagogue in Phoenix. Their son, Michael, and his wife, Kat, live in the lovely Northern California. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Alan. We will hold until the end for questions, but if you think of questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and I'll make sure that they're addressed after the presentation. So welcome, Alan. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Michelle, and thank you all for being here. And it is a true pleasure to be here with you and to be talking about one of my favorite subjects because it comes up a lot. Part of my work with the Jewish Community Relations Council is to be talking not just to other religions, but also lots of Jews here in the Valley. And sometimes they're not even sure what the different denominations and different groupings are, depending how they grew up. So I talk about this a lot. So I'm going to start by setting some background, and then I'll get to the fun part, which is what really are the differences. And I will get into that in terms of diet and clothing and traditions and so on. But first, I need to set some background to tell you where these three groups, Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform Judaism, came from and what are they. And I am going to be focusing on the world as it sits in Arizona, because in some places, like New York, Judaism is very, very different. And I could do a whole separate talk on the differences between Judaism in Arizona and New York, for example, and forget about Europe or Asia or elsewhere, or in Israel. But this is focused on what the scene is like here. But first, I'm going to start by dispelling a common misconception that Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform is not very observant, medium observant, and not observant, or high, medium, or low, or anything like that. Some people think it's that way. Very religious, not religious. Rather, they're different denominations with different traditions, practices, and theology. Let me say at least conservative and reform are denominations. Orthodox is more like a description. And this whole thing, there's a lot of muddiness you're going to see. You might describe Orthodox as being traditional European style Judaism, and conservative and reform being more American style that came along later. Those are broad characterizations. I'm going to be oversimplifying. You can also find Jews that don't fit into any of those categories, and that's fine. Many Jews, perhaps even most Jews, do not identify as either Reformed, Conservative, or Orthodox. They're just Jews. They're just Jews. And they may not belong to a synagogue, and so they don't get slotted into, I go to a conservative synagogue, for example. Part of the messiness is that Judaism is in part a religion, but it's also ethnicity, that's a hard word, but it's an ethnicity that you can be born into or you can choose to convert into. It's also a culture. And to some Jews, they focus on the religion part, the ethnicity part, or the culture part, and that changes everything. I'm going to give you the Cliff Notes summary of what the difference is, and then I'll go into the history. So Orthodox and conservative Judaism place the most emphasis on the personal observance of the religion, the relationship between you and God. They emphasize ritual, including following the Sabbath and the dietary laws. Those are very important. They believe that the commandments in the Bible were given directly from God and therefore must be followed. And for most part, conservative and Orthodox, more so the Orthodox, emphasize focusing your life within the Jewish community. Reform Judaism emphasizes more the cultural parts of being Jewish. It de-emphasizes ritual and emphasizes performing acts to make the world a better place, such as social justice. It's very ethical. The others are all ethical, so I'm not, but it's focused on that. It's also much more person to person. Assimilation into the broader culture, instead of focusing your effort within the Jewish community, is seen as being totally okay, perhaps even the goal. Many Reformed Jews believe that God inspired the rules in the Bible. Inspired, not necessarily gave literally. And outside the Ten Commandments, because they're inspired by God but not given by God, they're human-made rules that you can use to help guide your behavior, but you don't need to follow them literally. Okay, so that's kind of the top line. I will mention that there are many, many, many types of Jews. I mentioned Reformed, Conservative, and Orthodox. We'll spend a lot of time on that. You also probably run into the terms Ashkenazic Jew. Those are Jews who come from Central and Eastern Europe. You also have Sephardic Jews who come from Spain, Portugal, around the Mediterranean. Very different rituals, very different diet, clothing, everything. There is Mizrahi Jews, who are the Middle Eastern and North African Jews. There are Bukharian Jews who come from Central Asia, like Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. There's a big group of them here in North Phoenix, centered around Union Hills. There are Kohen Jews from India who've been there for centuries. There are Karaite Jews from Egypt, a lot of them in San Francisco. And one of my best friends, I used to live in San Francisco, was a Karaite Jew. And we always remarked that we had almost nothing in common in terms of our Judaism. And then there are Yemenite Jews, Ethiopian Jews, all different. But again, I'm focusing on the big Jewish types here in Arizona, and I'm focusing on those three denominations. So divisions of Judaism into different sects or groups isn't new. If you go back to the year 0, which is a great place, we tend to say year 0 CE in the Common Era. We tend not to say BC and AD. You may know, if you reading your history of Jesus, or the time of Jesus, there were the Pharisees They believed in the strict observance of the law. They were very synagogue focused. There were the Sadducees who were focused on the temple, the giant temple, which was not a synagogue, and the written law, and rejected all oral interpretations of that. And then there were Essenes who were like monks, and they rejected modern practices. They were very fundamentalist. And so divisions within the Jewish community have existed forever. But we're talking about America here. The first Jews who came to America were what we would call Orthodox. They were traditional European Jews. Think about Tevye in The Fiddler on the Roof. That's the type of Jews who came here. Ashkenazic Jews from Eastern Europe, Russia, Poland, whatever. They came here. I'm sorry, that was the second group. The first group that came here were Sephardic Jews who came from Spain, Portugal, and Brazil in around the 1600s. They focused their interpretation of Jewish law on what happened in Spain, Portugal, and Brazil. The second wave of Jews were the Tevyas. They came from Central and Eastern Europe, Germany. They had different traditions, but all these people were together what we would call Orthodox. They focused on living within a Jewish community. They believed that the Bible, the Torah, was given by God. You had to follow it. And what they did was what you would see today in most Orthodox Jews. What was interesting, though, was there were no centers of Jewish learning in America. No rabbis came from America, not during this period, 1600s, 1700s, early 1800s. They, if you needed a rabbi, you wrote to Europe, and they sent you a rabbi to move to your community in New York or San Francisco or Texas, whatever. So that kept it all a very European style of Judaism, of Orthodox Judaism, because all the rabbis came from Europe. So I'm skipping a little bit because I realize I'm talking slow. It's not going to be able to cover everything. So meanwhile, so in the United States, 1700s, 1800s, you had Orthodox Jews centered around a European style, Eastern and Central European style of Judaism. But in Germany, something was going on called, we now call that the Reform movement. Reform movement goes back a long time. And let me emphasize, by the way, it is not Reformed Judaism. It's Reform. I always see there's a store you can see on 7th Street. It's called Reformed Pilates. And I always laugh because no, it should be Reform Pilates, but that's the inside joke. So Reform Judaism came about in Germany because there was a problem that you were seen as either being a Jew or being a German. There's the same issue going on in France, in Belgium, in the Netherlands. You're either French or you were a Jew. You're either Dutch or you were a Jew. Many of the Jews wanted to be accepted into society. They wanted to be able to hold government offices. They wanted to be able to teach at prestigious universities or do things that Jews didn't normally. They wanted to rise in society. And so they wanted to evolve Judaism, reform Judaism in a way that you could be almost a German first or a Frenchman first or a Belgian first, and you happen to be one who was a Jew rather than a Christian. And so they decided to try to adopt Judaism to assimilate and adopt many of the current practices, which happen to be kind of church practices at the time. So, for example, instead of praying in Hebrew, they said, we're going to pray in the vernacular. We're going to pray in German or French or whatever. We're going to do away with our distinctive clothing. Again, you think about Fiddler on the Roof, you think about always wearing a hat like I am, or women dressing in a certain way. We're going to get away with that. We'll have our rabbis be more like priests, and they would wear black robes instead of traditional Jewish clothing. We will get rid of some of the dietary laws because that'll help us fit in better. So they started making those changes. They were reforming Judaism to fit more into the secular society. They didn't change everything. Rules about gender and marriage really weren't changed. The roles of women and men were pretty much the same. Marrying within the Jewish community stayed pretty much the same. But the Reform Judaism of Germany, mainly at that time, became looking more like, let's say, a Protestant denomination. It was still Judaism, but it looked, and the idea was to try to make it less, so you didn't appear as Jewish, so you'd fit better into society. So put that aside for the moment. We'll come back to it. Let's go back to America. Around in the late 1800s, a rabbi named Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise got sick of the fact every time Americans needed a rabbi, they had to write to Eastern Europe for it and get one out of Romania or Latvia or Lithuania. So he decided to establish an American style of Judaism, which included creating the seminary, the first American seminary for rabbis, which was Hebrew Union College, which I'm on the board of today. Also to create an organization to help manage synagogues called the UAC, the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, and also a professional organization for rabbis called the CCAR, the Central Conference of American Rabbis. You notice that doesn't have the word Reform, Conservative, or Orthodox in any of those names. This was meant to be just an American Judaism. However, as part of that, he decided to adopt many of the Reform practices from Germany and recommend them. He thought that would help the Jews in America fit more into American society. So that meant praying in English, changing the rituals, abandoning some of the dietary laws, getting rid of head coverings and wearing the prayer shawls, making it look kind of like Protestantism. And that's what we call today classic Reform Judaism. However, it was too much. Many of the rabbis and more religious people in the United States liked the idea of having an American Judaism, but they didn't like it based on that German Reform style that looked like Protestantism. So some accepted it, and that formed what today is the Reform movement, but others didn't, and they stuck to the old ways. The old, we want rabbis trained in the Eastern European style. We want to dress like Jews. We want to stay focused on our Jewish society, not in the broader society. And the other people we today lump together as Orthodox. So you might say that you had Reform and non-Reform, and the not Reform is Orthodox. Before that, no one would have used the word Orthodox. It was just Jewish. So about 20 years ago, by the way, the Union of American Hebrew Congregations renamed itself the Union for Reform Judaism. So now it's officially a Reform movement. But really, at that time, there were those two poles. Conservative didn't exist yet. But wait, there are some people who said, we like some of the stuff in Reform Judaism, but we like some of the rituals. We want to follow the rituals. We want to be a bit Americanized. So they came together and formed the conservative movement. So conservative movement is actually the newest of the three movements. Orthodox, you could say, is the oldest, because that was just being Jewish. Reform came along late 1800s, and to try to make it kind of Protestant-y. And then conservative was to try to find a middle ground. Reform is all about change and fitting in. Orthodox was all about unchanging tradition. And conservative was about being flexible. Let's fit in, but not give up everything. So there were centers of all of these different movements. The Reform movement, I mentioned the centers, focused on the seminary and the other things. The conservative movement is similar. They have a central seminary called the Jewish Theological Society, a seminary. It's in New York. They have their organization for synagogues, which is called the United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism. And then they also have a professional organization for rabbis called the Rabbinical Assembly. The Orthodox don't necessarily have one center. They do have some prominent things, the Union of Orthodox Judaism and also of Yeshiva University. But unlike Reform and Conservative, Orthodox is just traditional Judaism. So there isn't a particular center to that. How are we doing so far? All good? All right. So how many Jews are we talking about here? So there are about 7.5 million Jews right now in the United States. About a third of them, 35 to 40%, identify currently as Reform. About 18 to 25% identify as conservative, and about 10 to 15% identify as some type of Orthodox Jews. The rest are just Jews. They consider themselves Jewish by birth or ethnicity, but their main connection is generally cultural, and many of them are very secular. They don't worship, they don't go to synagogue, but they're Jews. They love their bagels. So, with that said, we've covered history, and hopefully it gives a context and sort of broad categories of what they are. And I'm going to say, particularly for the benefit of my friend Carolyn, who's on here, that she's going to say I'm massively oversimplifying, and indeed I am. And these are broad generalities or exceptions everywhere, and you could nitpick every single thing I'm going to say, and I know she will later on when she and I are talking later. However, I'm now going to go into what I think is the fun part of this, and I think the reason most of you are here, which is what are the differences between Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox Jews, again, here in Arizona. I'm going to cover a number of different areas. I'm going to cover theology, sacred books, definitions of who is a Jew, who is Jewish clergy, Sabbath rituals, the role of women and modesty, and then, of course, the one everyone always talks about, which is diet and the rules about kosher. There is one thing I am just not going to talk about at all, and that's Israel. That's because Israel is complicated. Not all Jews feel the same way about Israel, but those feelings about Israel don't break down neatly into the Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox. You can't say Reform think this, Conservative thinks that, Orthodox thinks that. It's way mushier than that, and so we're just not going to go there. So Israel's off the table. It's very complicated, but everything else is on the table. Let's talk about theology a little bit. So in traditional Judaism, which, remember I said, kind of fits Orthodox and Conservative, but in traditional Judaism, go back before any of these divisions were here. God created the universe, as we all know, performed miracles, and spoke directly to the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, talked to Moses, and talked to the prophets. God wants us to follow his commandments. And traditional Judaism is very obvious. God is a he. God wants us to follow his commandments. And the Torah, the Jewish Bible, was given to the Jewish people at Mount Sinai. There are other texts written much later, including the Talmud, I'll explain what that is in a second, that interpret the law. And in traditional Judaism, the interpretations of those laws are to be followed. In the Orthodox world today, rabbis are the interpreters of Jewish law, and all Orthodox Jews are expected to follow those laws. And the term for those laws that we say is halacha. Those are the laws. If you've read the Old Testament, if you read the Hebrew Bible, the 5 books of Moses, it can be very confusing, to say the least. Sometimes the laws are given or stories are given, and it's like we know that there are rules in there somewhere, but we don't quite know what we're supposed to do. These are things we can eat or not eat. We're supposed to do this with cloth, and we're supposed to do this with disputes with our neighbors, but Okay, but what does that really mean today? So that's what the Talmud is. Back 1,500 years ago, 1,800 years ago, a bunch of very, very smart rabbis got together, and scholars and rabbis, and they wrote basically interpretations and descriptions and commentaries on the Bible, which we call the Talmud. And by studying those texts, we can often figure out what exactly does this mean. When it says something kind of a poetic language in the Bible, what does that translate into in terms of what you're supposed to do or not do? It's not always obvious. I'm sure that the same is true in the Quran. I know it's certainly true in the New Testament. So again, that's the Orthodox view. In Reform Judaism, God inspired things. The stories in the Bible were inspired, but were written by humans. Because of that, the specifics of halakha, on Jewish law, are generally not binding. People can make up their own minds as long as it doesn't violate civic law. But whether you eat kosher or don't eat kosher, whether you do certain things on Sabbath, don't do certain things on the Sabbath, it doesn't matter. Do what you want. Do what you think seems best to you. It's not a question that God will be offended, because these aren't the words of God to start with. These are just guidelines. That is one of the reasons why many Orthodox Jews have a problem with Reform Jews, is because the Orthodox Jews, those laws in the Bible and the Talmud are halakha, they are laws. To many Orthodox Jews, they're just suggestions. To live a good life, do this. If you don't, that's okay too. Conservative Judaism is more like Orthodox in ways like halakha. They are less like Orthodox. I mentioned that the rabbis interpret the law. In conservative Judaism, the rabbis do not interpret the law the same way. So let us say, for example, you're not quite sure what to do about a certain practice. In an Orthodox community, you would go to your rabbi and you'd say, Rabbi, what do I do in this case? Or what's something to do here? And they would tell you, and for the most part, you should do that. If they, this Bible verse says this, how does this apply? And they tell you, then that is what you should do. Conservative Judaism, it's more like they might teach you a little bit, but again, leave that for you to decide. Okay, so that's kind of a theology. There's way more I could say, but that's probably sufficient for this purpose. Another difference, I would say, theologically speaking, is that many Orthodox Jews literally believe in the future coming of the Messiah. The Mashiach is the term we say in Hebrew. You will find a belief in the Mashiach somewhat less common in conservative Judaism, and almost completely gone, almost none of it in Reform Judaism. There are verses that we say in the prayer books during the Sabbath and during holy days in Orthodox synagogues that talk about the coming of the Messiah. You won't find them in Reform prayer books. The traditional prayers that go back hundreds of thousands of years, the Orthodox Jews say them almost exactly the way they were. Reform Judaism has changed many of them and has taken out some parts. Another part I just thought of, I didn't put it in my notes here, is that there's a great deal in Judaism traditionally about animal sacrifices at the temple. Many Orthodox still incorporate those verses and those prayers into their liturgy. It's completely gone from Reform Judaism. It has nothing to do with today. Take it out, because tradition is not as important. So my last bit on theology or expectations is what's expected of a Jew. And this may be the area that gets some people mad at me. In Orthodox Judaism, and to some extent in conservative, it's very important to practice halakha, the laws, in particular by performing rituals. Ritual is very important. Lighting the candles, um, wearing, putting things on the doorpost of your home, uh, saying prayers on the anniversary of an ancestor's passing, following the High Holy Day rituals, following the Sabbath rituals. Those rituals are wearing clothing, very important. Purity, marriage, how you raise children, which days you fast, the 3 times a day you should be saying your prayers. Very important in Orthodox Judaism, somewhat important in conservative. Reform Judaism, very little emphasis on ritual. It just isn't. It's just not there. That there's focus instead on, if you have a choice between picking up a piece of litter on the ground or lighting Sabbath candles, better to pick up the piece of litter. That's focus on you doing good deeds in the world. The term for that is tikkun olam, which means repairing the world and working on social justice projects. Again, that's not to say Orthodox and conservative don't do that, but that's not the primary emphasis, whereas in Reform Judaism, that is. Okay, enough on theology. Let's talk about sacred books. All Jews basically have the same sacred books, the most important of which is the written Torah, the 5 books of Moses, the Old Testament, sort of. The Christian Old Testament is a little different. There are other holy books as well. The prophets, the Talmud I mentioned, one called the Shulchan Aruch, which is a code of Jewish law written about 1,500 years ago to try to codify, take all that stuff and make it in one digestible book. Orthodox Jews tend to study them a lot, and particularly the Talmud. Reform and conservative Jews tend not to study the Talmud as much, and they do pick and choose. For example, there's a book in the Talmud called Pirkei Avot, which is wisdom of our ancestors, and so everybody loves that one because it's full of nice little pithy sayings and can be applied to lots of things. But a lot of the stuff of the Talmud tends to be focused more on by Orthodox Jews. And Reform and conservative rabbis will study it, but it tends not to percolate its way down to the congregation. But the biggest difference in holy books, as I mentioned, is that in Orthodox Judaism and conservative Judaism, the Torah is a literal word of God that was dictated on Mount Sinai to Moses, and that is it. It's correct. It cannot be flawed as the Word of God. Reform Judaism, a bunch of people were inspired by God and wrote these books, and they're good to read. We can learn a lot from them, but just because there's a commandment in there doesn't mean we have to do it. So that's sacred books. That was an easy part. The next thing I'm going to talk about is another contentious one within the Jewish community. Is who is a Jew? Which you might think is really obvious, but it's not. In the very ancient days, in the days of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the Jewish people, the term Israel wasn't used yet, the Hebrews were tribal. And think about most tribes. The men are the tribe. You have a daughter, you marry her out to someone, another tribe. You need a wife, you go to another tribe and bring in a wife. And the Hebrew people were the people in your tribe. It was patrilineal descent. If Abraham or Moses was your father, you were in the tribe. Zipporah, Moses' wife, was not a Jew. Her father was a Midianite priest named Jethro or Yitro. But Moses married her. She was in the tribe. Their kids were Jewish. However, later on, the traditions changed, and Judaism, as the Jews became a settled people, Judaism became matrilineal descent. Your mother must have been a Jew. And that's, of course, because you could be sure who the mother was, not necessarily the father. That's when we were not living in tribes, but living more in villages and other ways. So today, Orthodox and conservative Judaism still follow matrilineal descent. You are a Jew if your mother was a Jew. If your father wasn't a Jew, that's kind of a shame. But really, Judaism follows the mother. And Reform Judaism was that way, but starting in 1983, Reform Judaism changed and said, we'll accept either patrilineal or matrilineal descent. That is, you can claim Jewish identity if either your father or your mother is a Jew, if you were brought up Jewish. And that got to be, it's a real issue in our community. I'll give you a great example. A friend of mine is former U.S. Senator William S. Cohen, or Billy Cohen, as I call him. He is from Maine. I'm from Maine. We're both from the city of Bangor, Maine. His father, who was Jewish, last name was Cohen, ran the Bangor Rye Bread Bakery, which was a kosher bakery in Bangor. However, his mother was not Jewish. And so therefore, Billy was not Jewish. So his father wanted his son to have a bar mitzvah, but no rabbi would do it because Billy wasn't Jewish. So if you look in Wikipedia, it says that he's not Jewish, Billy Cohen. But today, this was obviously before 1983, today, his father, they could have joined a Reform congregation and Billy Cohen could become bar mitzvah. This creates additional problems, however, because immigration to Israel, Jews are allowed to, I said I wasn't going to talk about Israel, but Jews are allowed to emigrate to Israel and become Israeli citizens if they're Jewish. The Reform definition of Jewish is not the same as the Orthodox definition of Jewish. It's a political problem. So just a bit of more note on that. So my wife was raised Orthodox, as was I. We were married in Scotland. My wife is Scottish, and we got married with a full Orthodox wedding in Scotland. And they would only, the Orthodox rabbi would only do an Orthodox wedding if I was Jewish. How would he know if I was Jewish or not? They have no records over there. So I had to produce not only my document from my rabbi saying that I was bar mitzvah in an Orthodox ceremony, but also my parents had to produce their marriage certificate called a ketubah saying that they were both Jewish and they had a Jewish marriage, an Orthodox marriage. We had to produce those documents in order to have an Orthodox wedding. Because if I had been Reformed, they wouldn't have done it. Or unless I could have produced those documents. So it really matters today. Now, if the times are different, we were being married in a Reformed congregation, they would not ask for any of their documentation. Now, who is a Jew is a real issue. And it's a very contentious one, even today. Or you should say even especially today. Also, part of the who is a Jew is if people decide they want to be Jewish, you can go through a conversion process. Many Orthodox rabbis will not accept a non-Orthodox conversion. So, which kind of makes a problem if you want to convert and join a Reformed congregation. You're kind of stuck because, well, what if someday you want to emigrate to Israel or do something in an Orthodox community? Your conversion isn't accepted as valid. It makes people unhappy. Okay, I'm moving on. So you may have heard the term mitzvah. What does the word mitzvah mean? Well, for Orthodox and conservative Jews, a mitzvah is a commandment. There are said to be 613 commandments in the Torah, or mitzvahs in the Torah. Some are positive, thou shalt, and some are negative, thou shalt not. Thou shalt honor your mother and father. Thou shalt not murder. You get some of each. The collective term mitzvot, for again, Orthodox and conservative Jews those are commandments. With some exceptions, you're expected to follow them. Exceptions being like things to do with sacrifices in the temple that doesn't exist anymore. Well, you can't do that, so it doesn't apply. And you are generally ashamed in your community if you're caught breaking a commandment. So a commandment that is well known is Jews should not eat pork, using that as an example. If an Orthodox or conservative Jew were to eat pork, generally speaking, they would be ashamed if they were caught. If they would not brag, they would not post a picture on Facebook of them eating a ham sandwich. For Reform Jews, those are guidelines. Those are good deeds. They're ethical suggestions. There is no stigma in not following the rules, including the dietary laws. And so, although everyone pretty much follows the Ten Commandments, the whole don't murder thing is kind of universal. You will find Jewish people who go to a Reform synagogue every week, happily posting a picture of their lobster and bacon dinner on Facebook. That's just how it is. And those of us who grew up Orthodox, as I mentioned, I was president of a Reform congregation, a member of a Reform congregation. I keep kosher. But I grew up in that tradition. So, moving on, clergy. In Reform and Conservative Judaism, a rabbi is a spiritual leader or a teacher or a scholar. They officiate a life cycle events, though in Judaism you don't have to be a rabbi. It's not like Christianity with a priest. I'm not quite sure in Islam. But there are certain things I know in Christianity that only a priest can do. There are very few things, very, very few things that only a rabbi can do in Judaism. I'm not a rabbi, I'm as qualified to lead worship services as a rabbi. In fact, in many congregations, the rabbi doesn't lead congregations, but kind of sits off to the side. That's fine. Rabbis are held in great esteem, but they're not seen as authority figures. You ask for advice, but you can choose not to follow it. But in Orthodox Judaism, the rabbi is often an authority figure, and they can make judgments on halakha, on Jewish law. And for the most part, if you're an Orthodox Jew, you're expected to follow decisions about halakha defined by your rabbi. And because a lot of Judaism started a long time ago in little villages all around the world, the rulings of your local rabbi were the most important thing. And so traditionally, rabbis are men. However, the first woman Reform rabbi was ordained in 1974. Conservative Judaism followed in 1985. So you have a woman rabbi in the Reform or conservative movements could do anything a male rabbi can do. Though there are some older congregants who typically want to have a male rabbi, but that's changing. Most Orthodox, however, insist that a woman may not be a rabbi, period. Some groups, such as modern Orthodox, are inching this direction. They use the title Maharat for ordained women, and the first such was ordained in 2009, I believe. I'm not certain that there are restrictions on what a Maharat can do compared to a rabbi, but I'm not expert in that area because it's a relatively new thing and something I haven't studied all that much. But one of my parts of the understanding I have, though, is that if the thing that the rabbi is doing involves men, it has to be a male rabbi within the Orthodox movement. In conservative and Reform, it truly doesn't matter anymore. How do you become a rabbi, or sometimes ordained cantor? A cantor is a term that we use for an expert in liturgical music. And some cantors are ordained clergy and some are not. But in most Reformed Conservative and many, in Reformed Conservative and in many Orthodox, you become rabbi by attending an accredited seminary, such as Hebrew Union College or JTA or Yeshiva University, and then becoming ordained. It's, in the Reform movement, it's a 5-year master's degree program before you are qualified to become ordained. Just like you go to law school, then you pass the bar exam. You go to rabbi school, and then you pass the rabbi exam, and you're a rabbi. Congratulations. That's true in some Orthodox communities. In some Orthodox communities, however, there's a less formal but still long process that you become ordained when a very senior rabbi believes you have the skills and knowledge and temperament and experience to be ordained. Then that rabbi, not a seminary, that rabbi ordains you. We call that giving you a smicha is the term. And so maybe a panel of rabbis ordains you. And then anyone who accepts that rabbi's ordaining authority will accept your ordination too. That's how it was done in Europe in the old days. The rabbi in the village was getting old, so he found a nice young man who studied a lot and said, "Oh, you'll be the next rabbi," and ordained him. There were no seminaries. It was a different. And remember, Orthodox follows a lot of the old European ways. Let's talk about Sabbath observance. I'm whipping through this here. What is the most important holiday in Judaism? It is not the high holy days. It is not Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. It is a Sabbath. The Sabbath is so important. We know that because we have 52 of them a year. It's so important. We have to do it every single week. That is where you might find among the biggest differences between Reform Judaism on one hand and Conservative and Orthodox on the other. Reform Judaism, remember, not big on ritual. So they don't observe them. They might have a Friday night dinner with their friends. They might go to synagogue. They probably won't. They might light candles. But otherwise, they do everything they normally do, though some try not to work, as in doing like a day job or something for money. But they still get in their car, they still drive, they still turn on the barbecue, they still go to a soccer game, they still go to, a Suns game. If it's on Saturday, it's fine. Orthodox Jews or Orthodox and conservative Jews, so the phrase we use is Shomer Shabbat, observing the Sabbath. They follow a lot of ritual. They light candles, they attend worship services or both. The big thing is that they don't work, but working means not just your day job. It means not using electricity. It means not driving. It means not watching TV. It means not using your phone. It means walking to synagogue. If you don't live within walking distance, you don't go. It means that you spend your day studying. You don't do anything secular at all. That's why many Orthodox Jews live within walking distance of a synagogue. There are 6 Reformed synagogues in the greater Phoenix, Scottsdale area. There are dozens of little tiny Orthodox synagogues scattered all over the place within walking distance of small groups of Jews. It's a different model. Conservative Jews tend to be more like Orthodox Jews if they're observant, more like Reformed Jews if they're not. They often split down the middle. But that may be the biggest difference you find is Sabbath observance. My wife was at something recently in Montreal, and which has a tremendous Orthodox Jewish community, and she met an Orthodox Jewish woman. And the first question, literally, my wife was asked was, "Are you Shomer Shabbos?" That's literally the first question. And based on that, you decide how, was my wife someone worth dealing with? So, yeah, big deal. That's where you'll find the biggest difference. And again, one of the biggest problems that many Orthodox Jews have with Reform Jews. The role of women, another big difference. In the Reform world and largely in conservative, this is where conservative is more like Reform. Men and women are basically equal in terms of what they can do. Both let men and women become rabbis, lead prayer, perform Jewish rituals. There may be a men's club and a women's club in the synagogue, but religiously, they all are together. When there were many Jewish prayers require a minimum of 10 adults. In Reform and in some conservative parts of the world, that 10 can count both men and women. The Orthodox world, it's different. Men and women do not sit together in worship services. There's a line called the mechitza between them so that men can't see the women and be distracted. Women can see the men. It's okay if they're distracted because the prayers aren't as important, that the men are commanded to do the prayers, the women are not. And so therefore the men must not be distracted. Women, as I mentioned, can't be rabbis to perform many rituals. There are rules that say women should not dress like men. And so, for example, men tend to wear certain types of head garb. It's said to be bad for women to do so, like a yarmulke or a prayer shawl. And you get some places that if a woman's wearing a prayer shawl in an Orthodox community, there'll be trouble. Whereas in the Reform and conservative movements, there are beautiful prayer shawls for women. A man may not touch a woman who's not his immediate family or wife. So no handshakes. If my wife is meeting an Orthodox rabbi, she will not shake his hand. Well, he would be offended if she tried to do so. In the Reform world, that's not an issue. A woman cannot read from the Torah, read from the Bible, or lead prayers if men are present. And a woman cannot sit on a Jewish court. That has to be a male court with rabbis, because the rabbis are men, remember. So also, and this is another one that's really tricky, is that in Orthodox Judaism, the man, if there's a marriage is not working, the man has to approve the divorce. It's called the get. And if the man refuses to give the get, the woman cannot remarry. And that doesn't exist in conservative and Reform Judaism. Divorces, either one get the divorce, but the man has the power. It goes kind of back to that old tribal age I talked about in the very beginning. Intermarriage. Traditionally, Judaism has not liked intermarriage. Jews should marry Jews and have Jewish children. If the Jewish man had a non-Jewish wife, the idea was you bring them into your tribe, you're married Jewish. If a Jewish daughter married out, she was lost. Today, conservative and Orthodox Jews are very focused on marriage. Jewish to Jewish marriage is a way to continue the Jewish community. An Orthodox rabbi in particular will only officiate if both parties are Jewish to that rabbi's satisfaction. Most conservative are the same. If you want to marry a non-Jew, he or she has to convert. Reform Judaism takes a very loose approach. Reform rabbis may, but are not required to perform interfaith marriages. It's up to them, but they are allowed to by the movement. If they're doing an interfaith marriage, they generally require the couple promises to maintain a Jewish home and bring up any children as Jewish. Remember, I talked about matrilineal and patrilineal descent. So if either parent is Jewish and you bring the kid up Jewish, then the kid is Jewish in the Reform movement. So that's the role of women. Head coverings. So I'm wearing one. In the Orthodox movement, men will wear a head covering, a yarmulke, or a hat everywhere. In conservative movement, they will typically do so in synagogue or Jewish contexts. In Reform, almost never, unless maybe in synagogue, but if you go to a conservative synagogue, all the men are probably wearing a head covering. If you go to Reform congregation, maybe half would. They just don't. Ritual doesn't matter. I'm taking longer than I'd like, so I'm going to have to talk even faster as I get into kashrut, the dietary laws. So let it be stated that there are dietary laws or certain things that Jews should and should not eat, and they break down into two categories. There are those that are written in the Bible, which has a list or rules of permitted and forbidden food. For example, you can eat beef, but you can't eat pork. You can eat a salmon, but you can't eat a lobster. And that can be taken pretty directly from what's in the Bible. And then there were the other rules that were created later by the rabbis who wrote the Talmud, and also by local rabbis who look at the local restaurants and food supplies and make rulings as to what's kosher and what's not. And there are ways about cooking, and there are ways about cleaning, all sorts of things. Even many Orthodox even blowtorch their kitchens, their stoves occasionally. There's all sorts of rules. So the Orthodox, as a rule, keep kosher. And they have to buy their food that's certified kosher, only kosher ingredients, only been handled in certain ways. Like even for kosher wine, the rules about wine being kosher. Conservatives, as a rule, some keep kosher, some don't. And those that do follow the same guidelines as the Orthodox. Reformed Jews, for the most part, do not keep kosher unless, like me, they were brought up to keep kosher and they still do it. So that is another big issue. And I'll tell you two areas where this causes problems. One is when you're trying to do an event for the Jewish community. If the food isn't kosher, the Orthodox won't come, which annoys the heck out of Reformed congregation that wants the host to function for everybody, because they have to do things to a different standard, and they often just refuse and won't do it. That leads to a rift in the community. It is really hard. And the second is sometimes congregations in some parts of the country, let's say, aren't doing well and they want to merge together. And it's common to a Reformed congregation and a conservative congregation want to merge. Often the single biggest point of contention is, what do you do about the kitchen? Will it be a kosher kitchen for the conservatives or a non-kosher kitchen for the Reform? And often I have seen cases where you end up with two kitchens, and each congregation has, or part of that has the separate key, so that the Reformed congregation can't mess up the kosher kitchen. It's contentious. So those are some of the big differences. So let me summarize. So Judaism, remember, is a religion, an ethnicity, and a culture. And Reform, Conservative, and Judaism all share that. Orthodox and conservatism place a great deal of emphasis on personal observances of the religion based on what's happening between a person and God. They emphasize ritual, including the Sabbath and dietary laws. They follow the laws as were written largely in the Bible, in the Torah, and in the Talmud. And they believe that those must be followed. And often they believe that you should spend a bulk of your life or emphasis within the Jewish community itself. Reform Judaism is almost the opposite. It emphasizes culture, the cultural parts of Judaism, music and enjoying the food. Doesn't have to be kosher, but it has to still be a bagel. De-emphasizing ritual, emphasizing performing acts that would do that tikkun olam, making the world a better place. It's much more about interpersonal. Assimilation to broader society is seen as a good thing, not a bad thing. We must be part of the world. Many believe that God inspired the Bible and the rules in the Bible. But outside the Ten Commandments, they're not binding. They are human-made rules. And again, so you can see where a lot of these areas make a lot of contention between the communities, with, again, conservatives sometimes going with one and sometimes going with the other. And after that fire hose information, let me stop and take any questions if I haven't exhausted everybody.
Thank you so much, Alan. That was very illuminating. And so, yes, we do have a few questions in the chat. And the one I think I'm going to take first is there like a genetic element to being Jewish? You talked about ethnicity, you talked about culture, ritual, and all of the other categories with regard to theology, and holy days, but is there an element of it that is genetic?
The short answer is no, not really.
Okay.
I mean, if you go back and if you take the Bible stories literally, we're all descendants of Abraham.
Uh-huh.
But we also know that over the millennia, because it's been millennia, people have converted in or converted out, and converted in and converted out, and the Jews have moved, and there are periods of time where you took a wife from the local tribe or this or that. And so a sort of a fun answer is Jews believe, or the story goes that all the Jews, every Jew, living or dead, was standing at the foot of Mount Sinai when Moses received the commandments from God. And if you convert into the Jewish community, you were there too. So the short answer is there's no general ethnicity. Now, in certain parts of the world, if you're an Ashkenazic Jews in Eastern Europe, Russia, Latvia, Poland, they have some genetic markers, and we tend to see that with, for example, there's one type of inherited thing for breast cancer that a lot of Ashkenazic Jews have. So there are some, but there's so many Jewish communities all over the world that reality, like my friend Habib, the Karaite Jew, and he can trace his generation back like 15 generations. It's ridiculous. We probably have no common Jewish genetic markers.
All right. Thank you. And then another question, is there a distinction within Orthodox, conservative, and Reform on the afterlife, or are they more unified with regard to the afterlife? And your
Oh my
last,
goodness.
this is a good one.
That is such a good one. Oh, wow. I would say that a belief in the afterlife falls into the rules of Jewish mysticism. You don't really have that in the Bible. There are mystical works that talk about the afterlife, the world to come, as we sometimes say. Um, you would find them probably more believed by the Orthodox just because they're more traditional. And I think that a lot of Reform Jews tend to be more American and more rational, and we don't believe in stuff, no superstition here. And so I would say it probably would just be more prevalent there, but it's not like it's a denominational distinction.
Okay. Okay. All right. Thank you. And then just for clarification, so Bible, Torah, Talmud,
Oh my goodness.
Acts of Moses. So how do we make it sound as if we understood to use the right terminology?
It's so hard because some of to simplify. So let's say that there are 3 sets of books.
Okay.
Okay. The foundational text, the one that the Christians call the Old Testament, with some slight modifications, that's what I call the Bible, or I call the Torah.
Okay.
But the word Torah can be used in multiple ways. But to talk about the Torah, it's the 5 books of Moses. And then you have the books that came later, the prophets, Psalms and Samuel and a whole bunch of those. Those are the prophets, or Nevi'im, but you don't need to remember that term. And those all date back to, prehistoric times. Not prehistoric, but a long time ago. Though in some cases we know who wrote them, but they're old. And then you have the Talmud. Those are the commentaries on those older books, those 2 sets of older books. So, okay, I'm going to teach you a new word. The new word is Tanakh. Tanakh is the 5 books of Moses and the prophets. Together are the Tanakh. Talmud is a bunch of rabbis in the year 200 or year 100, they're like all over the place, came together and they wrote commentaries that explained and expanded on them. We know who they were. The Torah is like this big, the Talmud is like this big, and it's all very dense reading. It's all very complicated. But the book that the real holy book are the 5 books of Moses, the Torah itself, and that's what God gave to Moses on Mount Sinai. If you believe in that particular interpretation.
Okay. All right. That's
That
helpful.
makes sense?
Yes. Yeah, I think that's very
so you may have seen pictures of of pictures in synagogues of a rabbi holding up something on a scroll.
Mm-hmm.
That's the 5 books of Moses.
Okay.
That thing is a Torah scroll, which is parchment and 2 wooden rollers, and the 5 books of Moses are the content.
Okay.
Written in very hard to read letters.
Okay. Yes, we had a presentation, I believe it was in October, from a local rabbi, and she showed on
there's Rabbi Capel, I think, was
yes.
Yes. And so a funny story. Do I have time for a funny story? I'm gonna tell a funny story. So my parents are Orthodox, or my parents, we say of blessed memory, are Orthodox. And women never touch a Torah.
Mm-hmm.
My mother had never seen a Torah up close. So she came to visit us in San Francisco. They lived on the East Coast. And we had a woman rabbi, again, which was outside of her experience. Never had a woman rabbi before. My mother was Orthodox. But I mentioned to the Rabbi Ettlinger, that my mother had never seen a Torah. And she told my mother, sometime come down to the temple, and just one-on-one took out the Torah and put it on the table and said, let me show it to you. And that was one of the most beautiful things on Mother's life, because she said, as a child, she could not have dreamed of being allowed to touch it.
Mm-hmm.
That was man's world.
Yeah.
She would have been upstairs in the gallery.
Sure. Yeah.
The world has changed.
I'm glad she was able to have that experience in her life.
It was a beautiful thing. It really,
yes.
really was.
Yes. Lovely. Thank you for sharing that with us. And thank you for this very illuminating presentation tonight. I've addressed all the questions that were in the chat.
Well, somebody asked the question. Hang on. Someone said on genetics, I am 9% Ashkenazi Jewish. Am I a Jew? And the answer is, who knows? 23andMe can't decide if you're Jewish or not. It means you may have a Jew in your ancestry, but again, depending on in the Reform movement, they would say, even if you had a Jewish ancestor, if you weren't brought up as a Jew, then you're not really a Jew. Mm-hmm. In the Orthodox line, they would say, if you can trace back through your mother, then you're a Jew. Mm-hmm. But the reality is, it's a culture, it's a religion, it's an ethnicity, but it's not really a genetic basis. So I wouldn't say just because 23andMe or whatever says you have some Jewish ancestry. It's not like being a Native American where if you have a certain percentage, then you're in. It's not like that.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So, the 1% rule.
Yeah, that 1% rule was a legal definition by what the racist American government at the time.
Yes.
It was not a rule that the blacks came up with. And
no. That was imposed.
It was imposed on them. I mean, you take the same thing with in Nazi Germany. If you had one Jewish grandparent, you were Jewish, off to the gas chambers with you. And so those are all different than a religious definition.
Yes. Thank you so much. This has been wonderful. And I think we're all going to have a lot of food for thought after this, and we can at least speak with some measure of efficacy on the distinction. So this was great. Thank you so very much.
You're very welcome.
And
it was a pleasure.
I wanted to also point out, because I know that it will be a little bit of a window between now and our next ILM circle, which is not scheduled until January 28th. There's a bit of busy season with a lot of school breaks and such in between now and then. But our next session on January 28th is Buddhism, interfaith, and intergenerational collaboration. So it will also be at 6:30, our typical time. And I look forward to seeing you all there. Thanks to all of our guests for joining us tonight. And of course, thanks to Asra and Joe for putting this all together for us to have a wonderful learning experience. And thank you, Alan. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.